Good afternoon. I'm Grant Swartzwelder. Welcome to another edition of Oilfield Strong Webinar. As you know, we post these on our YouTube. So if you see something you like and want someone else to see it, please point them to YouTube and have them look under OTA compression. Have you also note that OTA Environmental Solutions has a new website, and two key things are on there. If you go to otaenvironmentalsolutions.com, we have a cheat sheet that Luis put together on Quado A, B, C, and some EPA issues that you can might find interesting. And then we also just a couple of days ago did an interview with James Kinney, who's Secretary of the Environmental Department in New Mexico. And he is talking about he believes that the Permian will be determined to be or designated to be non-attainment by the EPA before the end of the year. And so he discusses that, kind of his reasonings for that, and talks about Part 50 of some regulation that they've added, and which has to do with visualization of methane leaks. And then also talks about he is chairing the New Mexico Environmental Crimes Task Force. So that's an interview that you might want to hear, or have people in New Mexico that might want to hear. So go onto our website for that. But with that, let me introduce you to our two speakers today. Luis Vasquez is Vice President of Environmental Services for OTA. Gani is a partner in ESG Dynamics, has a background with Chevron, Manitarka, and then did his own startup, so a great operational background. The purpose of today's conversation is to talk about transactional due diligence, A&D type activity, and what you need to do from an environmental standpoint. And with some of the work that they've done, they've got kind of a different take on it. Want to look at buy side and sell side, looking at two different perspectives. On the buy side, kind of looking more at phase one, desktop phase one, kind of what you're looking for. And then sell side, which a lot of people don't think about, but getting assets ready to sell, sometimes doing some work beforehand can really help you make sure that transaction gets done. So it's so Luis, why don't I get started with you, and kind of if you kind of bring up kind of or talk about the buy side, what you look at, what type of work you do when you're looking at a potential acquisition.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me on. Nice to see you, Grant, Gani. I think this is what, the 10th time I've been on or something. I lost count about the 7th time, but it's always fun, and it's always never gets old. So as far as the before we get too deep into the discussion, I just wanted to point out that these phase one environmental site assessments or the discussion, they're going to be geared towards upstream oil and gas assets, not commercial properties where the ASTM standards are more rigid whenever you get down to commercial properties. Now, a phase one can, when it comes to oil and gas related, they can be easily described as a pre-purchase review of the assets to identify anything that could cause future liabilities. Either that's at the physical level, being out there on the ground, or in the environmental compliance reporting record keeping arena. So
why would you have a desktop version, which is all the administrative, and then you do the field side. Do you do those together, or can you do them individually? What's the thought process there?
Okay, so a full phase one would incorporate both portions, a field portion and then a desktop record review portion. You could split those up. We've seen that. We tailor our, they've been tailored to either strictly a desktop review because either the assets, it's a small purchase, not too large of a budget, or the individuals who are selling have kept up really well, or the buyer has their own staff that's doing the field portion of it. But a desktop review portion would be reviewing records from regulatory agencies, from the seller, public data, and the point would be, or the focus would be, to identify any missing, duplicate, or inaccurate compliance items that For example, air permits that may be either missing, H2S reports that may be missing, or maybe the air permits may require transferring, amending, or voiding if there's duplicates out there. Additionally, identifying current status of federal reporting, for instance, NSPS subpart Quad OA reporting, greenhouse gas reporting, and then also on the desktop review portion, you would identify violations, severances, inspections associated with either the company, the seller, or the assets. And lastly, an example would be reviewing aerial images on the desktop review portion of it to see if you can find any potential concerns or identify when the first equipment was added to the site. Now, so that was an example of the desktop review portion. Moving on to the field portion, the site reviews, site assessments, boots on the ground portion of it, you'd be looking for signs of contamination, pooled liquids, stained soil or pavement, observing the condition of surrounding vegetation that might give you an idea of whether or not some produced water had been accidentally spilled. You're looking out for inefficient, damaged, or faulty equipment out at the site, cleaning and maintenance practices. What we have done on some occasions is taken out our leak detection and leak detection cameras, our infrared cameras, to help identify any venting or leaking from sites, especially now that there may be some taxes on those methane emissions. It might be wise to look at if you have any emission issues at the sites you're trying to acquire. Other non-environmental, more safety items would be, if the site is sour, do we have H2S alarms on it? Does it have windsocks? Are they in good condition? Do you have supplied air stations on the site? And then do you have required signage from that the Railroad Commission might require you to have on your site?
Okay. Gani, when are these normally done? It seems like everyone does environmental after the PSA is signed. Is that right? Or when do you think these things need to be done?
Well, hi, Grant, and thanks for having me on. Glad to be here. You know, generally, if you're in the A&D space, you're there for a reason, and that means it's important for your business. And today, and being in the grind, if you will, myself for a number of years, you know how difficult it is to make a deal happen to begin with. So when you are one of the lucky few, perhaps in the acquisition process, or maybe you have a good universe of buyers if you're selling, and you're getting up to that PSA stage, either negotiating that PSA and generally getting closer to that end stage, that's usually when the environmental due diligence kicks in. That's been the conventional way of doing it for many years. And today, though, when you think about it, every day that you add to that PSA negotiation or to that timeline past the PSA is a day where something can go wrong, whether controllable or not, and that deal could fall apart. So looking at environmental due diligence, you don't want that to be the issue that makes the deal fall apart. So if you're a seller, conventionally, you may let the buyer find issues. I would suggest taking a proactive approach and doing an extensive health check, if you will, and do a lot of the things that Luis just mentioned from a desktop review perspective, and with plentiful time to remediate, be it regulatory things, remediation on the ground, reporting, whatever it is, before you get to that process, so that process goes smoother. And if you're a buyer, conventionally, again, that's usually done post PSA. And of course, you don't have access to that property, perhaps, to do a physical visit. But the desktop review section historically has been fairly expensive to do, not in terms of dollars, but in terms of time. So if you're grinding through dozens of deals, you're not going to do desktop reviews on all those. So automation in that regard is a good approach. Nowadays, you can do that in a day, a matter of hours. You can sit there live and do it. with proper tools. So that should enable your team to sift through and tune in to assets before you ever get into that hunt, because that hunt itself is very expensive to your organization as a buyer, your team's time, opportunity cost, and if you're negotiating a PSA, those legal fees stack up pretty fast.
So the idea is to maybe do your, at least a desktop early on, so you know if you've got an issue, can incorporate that into your legal PSA, the indemnifications, the baskets that you negotiate. Now,
yes,
a normal phase one or desktop takes how long? And then the way you propose, or you're doing it with ESG Dynamics, how long does it take with having it automated?
conventionally, the desktop portion would take a week, 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, depending on how large the asset is.
Sure.
Right? Now, when you automate that in a way where you access a tool that has all that data built in, at that point, the size of the asset really doesn't matter, and you're doing the same work in a matter of hours. So that's the difference. So that's what allows you to change the way you operate the A&D space. It allows you to make that part of your deal screening process. And when you go into that PSA negotiation, you know what you need to negotiate hard in terms of environmental issues, potential risks, liabilities. So that gives you a lot of tools and arms you with proper intelligence beforehand.
Okay. Well, and ESG Dynamics has automated this. So do you want to share your screen and kind of show some examples?
Yes, sure. Let me do that here.
Or did I just surprise you with that request? So it's.
I always have it up just in case. And yes, so I'm.
And then what I think you can also do is go into, because I think it really fits well with this health check, because you might kind of talk about what is health check and then what is desktop phase one and kind of how it separates out. And then also just we'll reiterate somewhere in here about from a sell side why you would even want to do this. So I'll give you some time to kind of maybe show some of these points.
Thank you. I'll try to be efficient with everybody's time. The health check is our product that integrates several key things. It's a data audit and a compliance audit. So pretty much everything we said as you do in terms of a desktop review, that and more, because we dig into insights and we're able to look at insights that conventionally you may not be able to catch. And the second part of that is peer benchmarking. Obviously, if you're a seller, that may be very important to you, preparing your asset to go into that buyer universe and looking at where that buyer universe stacks up in terms of their environmental performance. And you want the impact of your asset on their portfolio to be as low as possible. Because most likely at this stage, a lot of their upper management or generally employee compensation could be tied to those metrics. So it's very important to keep that in mind. And that's something we do as part of the health check. I'll jump into a few modules here to take a look at. So usually the first item we'll look at is greenhouse gas reporting. You know, that's something you do with the EPA, and there are a lot of great insights here. Perhaps in the past it was not very much an important point. It is becoming now, especially with new regulation coming forward and the methane tax coming forwards in 2024. Though still a lot of rules to be finalized, but that's something that's important to keep on the radar. So when we're looking at assets, when we're looking at companies, that's one of the first things we'll look at. By the way, we did release a great blog article on our website on the impact of the methane tax potentially in 2024 in a status quo scenario. You can visit our blog to get a copy of that report. So, okay, let's.
And on that, one of the big points that came out of that when I read it was that it seemed like the smaller or non-majors are the ones that are going to really be affected. And it's And there are exemptions for like greenhouse gas, or I mean, below a certain amount, but there is a widespread number of companies that could have, and it's like how much, 400 million or a huge amount of fines potentially for next year.
Yes, we estimated about $580 million impact on the onshore upstream industry in 2024 in a status quo scenario. Obviously, we were going off 2021 numbers. And what we saw is that, yes, the big boys are obviously somewhat ahead, not obviously, but ahead of the curve, and their methane intensity is already lower. And also they look at it, by they, I mean the feds, all the basins can combine into one for those methane tax calculation purposes. So the smaller guys are going to, 80% of the smaller guys that do report to the EPA today are going to be impacted by the methane tax in one way or the other. So it's fairly significant. So here's an example, Grants. First thing I did here, I picked a company that I knew operates in the Permian, starting with Warren, if you guys are on this webinar, but not necessarily, we're going to pick on you guys. So I picked a company that I also know operates in New Mexico. And one thing that's happening in New Mexico, Grant, and perhaps a lot of New Mexico operators know that, but if you're not operating in New Mexico, maybe not aware, is that the civil penalties are becoming a big major thing in New Mexico. And we've seen simple regulatory non-compliance item cause significant penalties. So far, an average penalty per operator per occurrence has been about $150,000. And we've seen over $1 million fines issued to operators in New Mexico for simple things like, hey, you didn't report your flaring. Hey, you didn't, you completed a well in a zone where that was not permitted.
So Luis,
I'm not saying those
Gani, does your desktop phase one and your work, will it identify those violations and those fines?
Yes. So what we'll look at are trends. So for instance, here we're looking at newborn trends for the past couple of years, right? As an example, one thing that jumps out right away is flaring. It looks like we're at zero, through 2020, 2021, and then it starts picking up. Likely what's happening is that somebody was snoozing within those 2 years, and then they figured out, oh crap, we need to report, otherwise we'll get fined. So this is a catch-up process. When we're looking at flatline zero numbers, we never believe them. That's not real.
Right.
So this is a story that we pick up on right away. And another thing we'll do immediately is we'll go to New Mexico spills, because flaring in New Mexico is something you report as a spill. We'll open up that module. Let me do that live here. Pardon. And we'll go to newborn, and you let me know if I'm taking too much time here.
I guess when we have everybody drop off, that'll be your hint. So, but they're still on it. So looks
right.
like you're still interesting enough for them to stay on.
So let's look at the same trends here for, let's say, newborn natural gas flaring, right? So we're seeing that starting with 2021, and at some point, I think it was in 2021, where New Mexico said, hey, flaring is a spill, report as a spill, report as an incident. So there's been some confusion around that, but for the most part, everybody started reporting. So we're seeing here in 2021 that counts and volumes are reported to the state, as a spill. Now, when we look at the same reporting as part of production reporting, it's not happening. So that's an internal issue now. So you got to go to your regulatory, be it a third party or internal team that does that, and say, hey guys, why do we have this inconsistency? And this is an inconsistency that we're seeing here real. So that's a small example, but in New Mexico, that can lead to hundreds of thousands in violations if not taken care of. Why are we talking about it here? Because if you buy that asset as a buyer, for instance, not aware that you could be on the hook for things, the regulatory agency will likely come after you, and you'll be on the hook for that. So if you're aware of these issues beforehand, that's something you can address.
Well, this also affects your sustainability report, your presentation materials, how much money, if all of a sudden there's a lot more flaring than you realize, then you're spending more money on this asset than you thought. So it really speaks to kind of the value of the transaction, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And it can be quite impactful to that transaction and to the economics of that transaction. You know, of course, if it's a $1 billion deal and you figure out that you're on the hook for 50,000, it may not change the economics that much. But if you're looking at a $15 million deal and you're on the hook for $1 million, then that's a different story. And you know, we'll look at a variety of different factors here that even the conventional phase one doesn't look at. And we'll dig into that and pretty much come back with a very customized report. Some of our clients do sign up for a subscription and they play with this data themselves. But looking at you know, things industry-wide is also very interesting. For instance, here we're looking at inspections in the state of Texas, and we know that on an annual basis, you can expect 300, 400,000 inspections in the state, and looks like the industry is trending down in terms of non-compliance trends. So that's good to see that only 5% or 5 to 10% of inspections lead to a violation, which probably is still high. We should do better.
So Luis, on something like this type of information from a phase one, what does that tell you about whether it's inspection or help put some meat around this data and what it tells you, and what are you going to be doing with it in a phase one or in a transaction?
Well, that's going to give you a compliance history. You're going to review all the records, all the missing records, connect the dots, see the red flags, and it's going to provide a compliance history. And the field portion will provide that, you know, physical liability history or evidence. But this is going to help you know, go walk in with eyes wide open and know what you're getting into and see the risk and see if you can manage it.
It also seems like by doing this fairly quickly, you can really hone in on what leases or what locations you've really got to, you know, maybe need to focus on.
Yes, we've used these the desktop reviews to identify the problem children, and then sample the site visits from the desktop review so that we can go out and check those that were identified through the desktop review of having multiple spills or flaring issues or just things of that nature.
Okay. So Gani, sorry to take away. It looks like you're running through some other options here. So if you want to explain to the folks what you're looking at or flipping through.
Right. So what I was looking at is I wanted to see, again, sorry, newborn. Another thing we check is consistency of reporting. And it's important because if data is out there and obviously the public has access to it, you want to ensure, maybe not ensure, but make as much effort as possible to make it consistent. So let's look at newborn, for instance, here again, Permian Basin. What we're looking at is data reported to the feds in terms of the well inventory. So, for instance, we're seeing here that there's been some acquisitions of wells, some divestitures, some plugging, a lot of completions. One number that immediately jumped out in the Permian, you know, the company goes at a pace of 80 to 70 wells completed a year, and then it jumps to 150. Is this number real? So by going back to the state database, which I think I had here, and looking at well records, we can quickly figure that out. So let me do that here in just a couple of minutes. I'm just picking random examples here. Obviously, we'll do.
I'm going to have to figure out why you don't like Mewburn or want to highlight them. So,
well, it's a company that I actually like. I think they do a fairly good job.
No, I'd agree. And well, they've got 20 plus rigs out there in New Mexico, so I'm sure people are watching them. So it's anyone in New Mexico. It sure seems, from what Luis, from what you've seen, it sure seems like New Mexico operators have a target on their back.
And look, and fair enough. Looking at the drilling and completion trends for the company, we're seeing that there's been a ramp up in past couple of years, especially in 21 in terms of wells drilled. Boom. So that number is somewhat real. Usually they don't match exactly, but we know that, okay, whoever is doing this work is likely paying attention. So these are the checks we'll do as part of the health check. We'll do a benchmarking exercise where we compare all these metrics to the peers and come back with a report. Thanks, Grant, for allowing me to share this.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's so what, and real quick on the sales side, you mentioned on the health check, you also have benchmarking. And that's always interesting because you've got ratings out there, but it seems like you focus more on benchmarking. Explain real quick why from a sales side, that would be important to understand how and you alluded to it a second ago, but why benchmarking could be helpful if you're a potential seller or a potential buyer. Right.
I think it comes back to, first of all, understanding where you stand relative to your peers. If you're a seller, you're thinking about your buyer universe. A lot of times, a smaller company, putting an asset together, drilling it up, proving it up, is looking likely to sell to a bigger player, maybe a public company, right? Those are flush with cash today and likely are the buyers in the market. However, they have more scrutiny on their hands. They have investors that want not only cash returns, not only those dividends, but also to have a good environmental track record. So if your asset is not in tune with that, then the buyer will either say, hey, that's too much, not going to touch it, discount it, or they'll have to put a story around that saying, hey, we're going to pick up this asset and we're going to clean it up. In any occasion, you have to, as a seller, understand that buyer universe, who is doing those deals and who's not, where they stand, where their metrics are, and how you compare it to those. And if it's a company that does not buy assets to clean them up, then you better clean them up yourself prior to that. We've seen examples with transactions where high flaring or high emissions, excess emissions didn't really matter for a buyer, like Diamondback, right? They'll come in, they'll buy them, they'll clean it up themselves, and that's a good story, right? That's their strategy. But perhaps a company like Chevron may not be interested. Not that they're a big buyer, but just an example, right? So that's why it's important to understand where you stand relative to others, where the industry is.
And I think the point there, and this might be a good closing point, is the scrutiny that the industry is under from a regulatory, from a liability, from a risk standpoint is probably higher than it's ever been from regulatory and environmental advocacies, and also it's kind of changed the process to doing environmental more upfront than kind of as an afterthought. Any thoughts on that or final comments, or we'll close it at that?
I think we covered it, Grant. Right. And again, thanks for letting me share this.
So everyone, if you have additional information, Gani, what's your website? That if they want to look at that cheat sheet?
Yes, it's esg-dynamics.com. Visit our blog. There's a lot of great stuff there on A&D transactions, and the latest blog on the Inflation Reduction Act. I think it will it will be quite interesting for you to look at. I encourage you to do it. All it takes is your email, and we'll send you a link to the file. So it's when I just put that analysis together with our team here, I was surprised to see what I saw. Yeah, it's a huge number and disproportionately focused on the smaller guy, which is never good. So good. Well, everyone, appreciate it. Again, OTI Environmental Solutions has a couple of posts there with Secretary Kinney and a cheat sheet that Luis did. Luis, Gani, thanks for attending. Thanks, everyone. See you next month. Thank you, Grant.